group meeting. Before I, obviously I'll declare the meeting open, but we do have apologies from Tom Belford, Bill Dalton, Shelley Burnfield and Sandra. So would someone like to move that the apologies be endorsed? Thank you.
Kevin Watkins.
Yeah. Sorry, just in terms of some people don't have names, so for our...
Kevin Watkins, Hastings District Council.
Up to Hawke's Bay DHB.
thank you.
Mr. Chair, can we also add Mayor Craig Little to the list?
Okay, thank you. So in opening the meeting, I'd invite Charles to Kirkia.
Kia ora tātou, mā whiki tātou. E te atua kaharawa, wa tuku atu wairu ki te taumata ake. Kia wā te tini ngaro. Kia ata whakaro i a tātou mahi tēnei rā. Kia mai hoki i a te nākau māki ki tēnā ki tēnā o mātou. Kuna ta whaka muimuti tēnei wā. Ki koe anu hoki tō tātou kaupaka ora āmene. Kia ora, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. In terms of conflicts of interest, is there any conflicts that need to be shared with the meeting? If not, no conflicts. Confirmation of the minutes that were previously circulated, they were unconfirmed. So we're looking for a mover and a seconder, please, to accept.
Can I make a comment on the minutes first?
Yes.
I just noticed I wasn't listed as being here. In fact, I was for Hastings. One of the two Hastings representative, Tanya, was deputising. What do you call it?
Alternative.
She wasn't officially here. Yeah.
Okay. No,
Simon Nixon, in case you haven't.
we'll record that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other amendments to the minutes? If not, would someone that was here like to move that they be accepted as a true and correct record?
Yeah, I can do that. I've read them.
Simon?
That's how it knows.
Seconded. Thanks, Councillor Weiss. All those in favour?
Aye.
Carried. Moving on now to the actual business of the meeting. Is there any items that need to be added to the agenda for discussion later? If not, then we'll move on to the Three Waters review. I would make a comment that the paper that's currently in the agenda has now been withdrawn. There's just some question marks about how that's been authored. So that paper's withdrawn, and Tony, though, is here to give you an update on the position as it is, effectively as of today. So it's a more current view of the world. So for those that don't know, I'll let you introduce yourself, Tony, and where you're currently sitting.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Goodlass. I'm the Program Manager for Hawke's Bay LAS. So I'm employed by the 5 councils of Hawke's Bay, a role that commenced in October. And one of the key strategic projects that I'm working on with our CEs is the Three Waters Review. Yes, I did not author the report, so I am happy to take questions if you do have from it, but I have not read it. So what I am doing is just giving you a quick update on where we're at with the review. Okay, so technology. So the first thing I just wanted to clarify is the 3 waters that the review is looking at. So we're looking at the infrastructure and services and how we deliver those in terms of drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. And just to give the background context, so I think everyone is aware here that the government is reviewing the regulation and the supply arrangements for drinking water, wastewater and stormwater to address the current challenges that we have. The main challenges have really been identified around meeting our community expectations in terms of the water quality treatment and management, meeting the regulatory requirements for water quality treatment and management, and the ability to replace ageing infrastructure or fund and manage new infrastructure going forward. In Hawke's Bay, we've got declining rate bases in some areas and high growth in others. And we've got high seasonal demands in tourism centres, and we also need to adapt for changing climatic events and change itself. So the government review has got 2 work streams. The immediate priority is the overarching shape and form of regulatory arrangements, which they're looking to plan for June this year. We've just to clarify, this review is not focused on the regulatory side of the reform, but on the service delivery. We have been engaged in some meetings with DIA to talk about some of the, reforms that they're thinking about and provide some feedback into. But for the purposes of today, we can talk about the service delivery. In saying that, we do have some technical experts here, and so if there are some regulatory questions that do come up later, happy to respond, although we can't be specific around what's changing at this stage. Next page. So the Three Waters review. The feedback that we're getting is that what we're doing here is very progressive. The Hawke's Bay Three Waters review was initiated by the chief executives of the 5 councils of Hawke's Bay, and Morrison Lowe and WSP Opus have been engaged by us to provide an independent review on the effectiveness of our existing structure, the governance, the operational and delivery models, as well as recommendations and potential improvements to those models. Central government are liaising with us closely on this. We're probably the key region that is proactively working on what a model could look like. And as such, we've been advised that she's supportive. We're engaging with DIA around how they may support us in any future model going forward, and in particular what potential funding could look like for that. So really this is about us having a window of opportunity to provide Hawke's Bay's perspective into the government review, so that we can address the key concerns that they have. I guess, and Wayne might be able to add to this, is that the opportunity here is for us to influence government versus having change mandated upon us. Wayne, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's probably the key point, that the government have this view that the only way to solve what they see as being some of the major issues with the delivery of water and what they see as being problems in the wastewater stormwater area is that aggregation of suppliers needs to occur, and that aggregation can be at a number of different levels. But what they are very interested in is how we look to manage those problems, and also how we address issues such as the funding problems that some of the other councils have with that. And they want to use that then as a model. And this very much aligns with Local Government New Zealand's position that any changes should be regionally driven so that it meets your community's needs. There's also a bit of pushback too from some of the larger metros. They're saying they've got their own issues, and they don't want to be subsidising everybody else's water.
Okay, thank you. And just Wayne is the key sponsor from the CE group on this project as well. So in terms of the project steps, we've spent a lot of time in January and February assessing our current state in terms of the resources, the systems, the service, understanding exactly where we are and what gaps we have. We've also done a high-level options review. And as part of that, we've spent a lot of time, which some of you have been involved with, is coming out to the councils, the councillors and other stakeholder groups in terms of understanding the key principles and objectives for our region that will drive the critical success factors and how we determine which is the best options for ourselves going forward. Currently, we have a long list that we have now developed to a short list, and we're doing the detailed analysis around what that could look like to bring forward a preferred option, which will be happening beginning of May, which we'll then challenge and test, and I'll talk about that later. The time frame is to deliver a report to the CE group at the end of May. So the time frames are short, but that's driven by government in terms of their time frames for the reform. So I'm just going to skip over this, but this is what I was just talking about, is the principles and objectives are really driving how we come to a preferred option for our region. This one. So the following are really the key themes that have emerged from the series of workshops to understand the key objectives and principles of our approach. So funding of infrastructure is absolutely key. We know that within regions in Hawke's Bay that we have real issues around the funding of infrastructure going forward to meet existing and future requirements. Resilience in terms of the physical infrastructure, the people and the systems, doing the current state assessment has really given us a good insight to the issues that we have with our infrastructure, whether it be from an ageing perspective and renewals. The impacts of the three waters system on the environment, absolutely key, has come out in every workshop, particularly around the Māori engagement that we've had in terms of the mountains to the sea and the way that water is. This review is about three waters, but we should look at it in a one water term, from mountain to the sea. Clearly also, value of water was discussed, not in terms of just monetary value, but in terms of people not understanding the value of water and the education in our communities that needs to be developed around that, and also from a cultural value perspective. One of the other key things was that in any model going forward, there needs to be a role for Māori, and not just at a governance perspective, but how do we bring those cultural tikanga and that into a new model going forward. And obviously the efficient and effective provision of services. So the Māori committees, we met with the Wairoa Standing Committee, the Māori Joint Committee, Napier, the Regional Council, Regional Planning Committee and Māori Advisory Committees, and also Te Tai Whenua o Tamatea in Central Hawke's Bay. The themes were consistent through all of these workshops, and there are broad and varied interests, but key was that water and our environments are interconnected. What we do in one has consequences for the other. We need to think about the cultural significance of water and the impact of stormwater on our waterways, and also look at how we incorporate Te Ao Māori in any new model. We need to seriously think about how we incorporate partnership in terms of governance and some of those tikanga practices. So, out of all that, we developed our key principles and objectives, and this is how we've defined our shortlist for the review. So, firstly, we need to provide the three waters in a way that's affordable and effective for all in our region, and not just at a council level, but at our ratepayer level as well. We need to make sure they're safe, reliable and resilient, that we have a meaningful role for Māori in that model, and that the value of water is at the centre of any structural operational model that we bring together. To provide the water services in a way that suits urban and rural communities and is set up for the future so that it's scalable. And we need to make sure there's enduring capability and capacity. And when I talk about capability, talking about skills, we have a real issue in drinking water, wastewater and stormwater in terms of the skills that we have within region and nationally. So we need to think about that in the model and how we build that capability and how we recognise what this means for capability in some of the outlying areas as well. So Central Hawke's Bay, Wairoa. So some examples of the different models that we're looking at. Along the bottom here, we've got a table, and this really is how we, a high-level view of the table that we use to assess different options. And all of these different examples of models have differing views in terms of council involvement versus an external organisation, and I'll come to that. So the first one we've got as an option is a Centre of Excellence, and RATA is an example of that. Now, whilst that focuses on roading, what it means is that they have a technical director who reports to a governance group with representatives from each council. So we develop a Centre of Excellence, and then that model is then provides support into the various councils. So in terms of that, all of these decisions would lie still with existing councils. The next step is around developing a shared services model. Masterton and Carterton have a example of that, where from a roading perspective. So in this case, Carterton contracts Masterton to deliver its roading program. Now, different service levels can apply to that sort of thing, but it's the opportunity to leverage off the bigger council's contracts and skills and resources. The other opportunity we're looking at is around joint procurement. So how do the councils approach the market together to engage with third parties for services? The next one is Shared Services Business Unit. Now, NTA is an example of that, which is the Far North, Kaipara, Whangarei, Northland and NZTA. Whangarei is the host council in this respect, and the NTA business unit is responsible for the strategy and planning, the capital works, the operations, maintenance and procurement. But the councils still hold the decision making on this. The next example is Wellington Water, which is a management council controlled organisation. So this is jointly owned by Hutt, Porirua, Upper Hutt and Wellington City Councils, as well as the Wellington Regional Council. The CCO approves the operational decisions and provides administrative support, but otherwise all councils are still responsible for the aspects without the input of the CCO on the strategic decisions and their future plans. One thing to be clear about this model as well is that the funding that comes, the councils still collect the funding and they determine what the rates are, and then that funding is only spent within each individual council. Porirua, for example, may not have the income or be able to afford the infrastructure that some of the others do, but they do get the benefit of all the technical expertise and the operational management of that CCO. Now, that doesn't mean to say if we look at that model that we wouldn't do something slightly different as part of looking at the outcomes we're looking for Hawke's Bay. And then at the end of this, we've got the asset owning CCO, which is Watercare in Auckland. Now, this is owned by Auckland Council, and the water and wastewater service. They're the water and wastewater service provider for all of Auckland. They're not the stormwater provider. Although, in saying that, they're linked, aren't they, John?
Yes. In Auckland, they do have combined sewer stormwater networks, which creates a number of problems for both entities.
Yeah. So the CCO in this case is responsible for all aspects of this decision making. There is a board of governors that sits across Watercare, and saying that also happens for Wellington Water as well, who then report to the council. So it's an independent board of professional directors that sit across these organisations. A really good example of an asset owning CCO is the latest project for Watercare, which is the funnel interceptor for stormwater. So that's a multi-billion-dollar project, strategic project across the region. I guess the question is, would something like that be achieved if we were looking at management CCO, where those decisions are held separately, the funding's held separately? Here, the asset owning CCO is the one who sets the rates and also takes that money in on a regional basis and then decides where to use it.
So just a wee point of distinction there. Watercare don't rate. They don't have rating authority, so they invoice for their services on a volumetric basis. So every water supply is metered, and customers are charged on a volumetric rate for their usage, and wastewater is also charged at a ratio of their water usage.
Okay.
That's right.
Thank you. That's why I've got these guys as backup. So where we're at now, we're currently evaluating these options. So one of them is the status quo. And what I just need to note is status quo as it is different because we've got regulatory change coming in, which is really going to change the way we need to operate significantly in terms of the compliance requirements and changes. The next option that we're considering is the Three Waters Shared Services Business Unit, look at using current council funding. Option 2, we're going to look at a regional management CCO, but we're going to look at a couple of options around using the existing current council funding within council, or look at a regional funding model. The other option we're looking at is the Three Waters Regional Asset Owning CCO with a regional funding model. In addition, because this report is going back to government, we're making sure that we are also assessing the marginal costs and benefits of a subnational arrangement. So we're going to look at those opportunities where we could join up with Wellington Water or such, or look at the extension of Hawke's Bay. We're not going to put a lot of effort into that. It's not our preferred option, but it's the right thing for us to do in terms of delivering a full recommendation back to government. So, as I said, we are currently in the shortlist assessment. We expect to present a preferred option the first week of May, which we will then, over the following 2 weeks, do some challenge and testing with the project control group, and then at the end of May, we expect to be able to present to the CEs the recommendation form of a report. At that point, the chief executives may ask us to go back and request some more information or some more detail. If they're comfortable with the report, then our expectation is that we will be coming to council to talk about the next steps, which was likely to do some more detailed design and analysis associated with the preferred recommendation.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add a couple of points
Please.
To what Tony said. So with the transition to a new structure, whatever that may be, there is the opportunity to get some funding from government to help with that transition. So we've been in discussions with DIA regarding that, so that will help with that process. The other thing too, which I think this committee needs to be aware of, and it's something which, when we look at whatever structure we use, is the changes to the regulatory framework which are being proposed, and in particular some of those changes and the responsibilities that it's putting on a council, and I talk in particular around private water suppliers. So if any house on a private water supply is supplying more than one property, they need to have a drinking water plan, water safety plan, and that plan then becomes the responsibility of the TLA to ensure that it's in place. And if they don't have one, then it's our responsibility to get one into place. So that comes at huge risk to councils. And I think, so one of the things that we need to be really careful of is that this structure needs to be able to manage that if that is where the government is going, because they have some concerns around private water supplies, and I think there's something like 800,000 across New Zealand.
Just on that point, we have included in the attachments some of the information that was shared at the workshop, and that identifies some of the new or the proposed regulations. So that's in your pack of information with your papers, but we'll touch on that later on in the updates.
Chair, could I just ask a question?
Yes, please. So.
Just picking up on Wayne's point there. Does private mean sort of tanks and springs? I mean, is it everything? And what about the distribution system? You're feeding stock on one hand.
No, so it's if you're feeding another house. So I'll use example of Jervois Town.
Yep.
So we have a number of houses down there. You've got a house that's got a private bore, and then they are feeding 3, 5, some of them 10 houses. So under this regulatory change, they would be responsible for having a water safety plan, and they would be making sure that that plan is in place. For a farm, Like as an example, talking to one of your councillors that lives out on Glengarry Road. So they have a tank system, and I think they feed a manager's house. That would then count.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yep.
Yeah.
So they would then be responsible.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Certainly through you, Mr Chair, there are a number of private water suppliers in the South Island that provide drinking water and stock water from the same system, and that would definitely challenge them around how they manage the risks associated with that supply. So it's going to be challenging nationwide.
I mean, the regulatory aspect of it looks fairly daunting from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, and I think it is, and I think that's why it's so important to, we need to take that into account when looking at a structure, because it's going to come down to capacity and capability within that structure to do it, to manage it. And so we just need to make sure that we can, because it is going to put a lot of risk onto councils.
Just have a question, Gareth, on that line. Thank you. This is probably to Nick. These private water schemes, have they been a particular issue in terms of public health in the past that you can recall?
I think there's a variable quality around the private schemes. Some are set up well and some are not. There's two different types actually. There's a different standard for something called a rural agricultural scheme. So that is designed, the standard for that is specifically designed to manage a situation where there's no need to treat the water providing to the stock, but there is need to ensure the safety of the water to the homes. But the other type of private supply would be smaller community supplies. Some of them have been with new subdivisions, some of them are in well-established communities, some are associated with schools or papakanga, and there's quite a variety in terms of issues. It's very hard to actually demonstrate the actual health impacts of those systems because they're generally quite small numbers of people, but we certainly have had problems with the detection of E. coli and needing boil water notices and so on.
Just to follow up from that, Gareth, is it something that keeps you awake at night, Nick?
Prior to Havelock North, I was more concerned about these water supplies than I was with Hastings water supply. That was before Havelock North.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you for that.
Mr Chair, can I just raise a couple of points, and they actually go back to the paper that we were given. First of all, just in clause 7.1, we talk about the three waters across quality, treatment and management. You'll recall that when we formed this group, the DHB was quite insistent that quantity should also be part of that, and I just think if it isn't, I think it should be in it. And we feel that peak demand load needs to be considered as part of the quantity, as part of that. The second point is, in the middle of last year, we sort of identified, I think, and agreed that the Public Health Division of the DHB could make a significant contribution. There's a feeling that perhaps that Nick's team haven't been used as we'd anticipated through the earlier parts of this, and I think it's only in recent times really that they've become engaged. And yeah, from our DHB governance board perspective, we're very keen to be engaged with the review team, either at the board level, we can provide you with some time, or through any of our other governance groups. But just to expand on that a little bit more, can I perhaps ask Nick just to talk about what we think could enhance the work that's been done?
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, so Tony did come and see us, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, which was very useful. We had the same presentation, but it did occur to me that there is a slightly different perspective that we have that I think would be helpful to the project. One is around essentially the public health purpose of all of this infrastructure, which is obviously to provide a safe environment for us to exist in, and particularly in urban environments, and it's the foundation of the public health movement, provision of safe drinking water and sanitation. So we think that there is some value in bringing that perspective, particularly to the principles and objectives. But the other thing I think that struck us when we looked at the principles that have been identified to date is there hasn't been an explicit focus on health outcomes and equity. And the equity perspective, I think, is important because the funding of this infrastructure, depending on how it is done, has potentially to financially impact much more on communities and people with with less resource than on people with more resource. And it's related to the issues around policy and rating policy that various councils have. So we think those two perspectives would be useful in assessing the short list or the long list.
Okay, no, well, Tony, have you?
So yes, I did have the opportunity to meet with Nick and his team. At a presentation level, I've given you the high level objectives. I just want to confirm that equity is a key part of the principles, just not displayed in here. And absolutely happy to, we'll continue to engage. And as I said, the next stage is around the detailed design, and certainly we would be involving this group as part of that. Health, we just need to make sure we get some wording right, and that we've covered off some, that the safety, the health, that sort of thing is a key objective of this project. People.
Good question, Gareth.
Yes, please.
Yeah. In the table, when you head up there when you go through the decision-making process for the options to bring in front of us, one of the things that I thought wasn't there, maybe it's just one of the things you should have in the mix, is the fact that the two options that are you put up there with Wellington and Auckland, with water care and whatever they call themselves, Wellington Water. Obviously, they are areas which are geographically together, whereas we're geographically spread out a wee bit. So whether that changes the way that you look at that, I don't know. But if that's something that you've considered, that would be great.
It's a good point that you raised that, councillors. One of the things with Wellington Water, that they've actually been up here trying to recruit us to Wellington Water, haven't they? And the geographical spread, in their view, is not an issue. So some of these, other models, the pipes don't need to be linked for these to be effective models.
Which is similar to water care in Auckland. So they have, when they were amalgamated, so they've got areas to the north and south which aren't connected at all. So they've got a large geographical spread.
Okay, yep.
Just on the points that Nick raised, I mean, some of those are more at the higher governance level that need to be considered. The primary focus around this is the structure, to make sure that we've got the right competencies, skills, capacity, etc., to manage the infrastructure. But you need to take into account those principles when you look at whatever structure you come up, and particularly it then comes down to whether you have where the assets sit within a council or not, because that will then determine how you fund your infrastructure and some of those principles that you're talking about.
Just to comment on that, I suppose some of that would, if you were to go into a council-controlled organisation, for some of that would be manifest through the arrangements that you make with that organisation, and what you set up as the objectives for that organisation.
Yeah.
So, if you set an equity objective for them, then it would be potentially able to deliver that.
Through you, Chair, I think the other element in as Tony and Wayne have talked about, is in the feedback back to government, those equity issues. I know LGNZ, when they run their big workshop, there's some of this is around also how do you, the example and the facts that we'll working through on this business case as an example might highlight some things where actually for some communities, but on those on fixed incomes and low incomes, to do the right thing to get the right public health outcome. Actually, there's another reset that requires a different level of support from the central government side around social supports and so forth.
Any other questions of Tony? If not, well, thank you very much, Tony. And again, would someone like to move that the report or the presentation that Tony's made be accepted? Or be received and noted, most probably is a more appropriate terminology. Second it.
And you're due to report back in May, isn't it?
Correct, to the Chief Executives in May,
Yep. Okay.
end of May.
And I'd be keen for your guidance as to whether you'd like to have Tony come back and present to this group following that. Obviously, there will be presentations to individual councils, but collectively, it would be appropriate to have it most probably at this, because there is a specific spin-off in terms of the outcomes from this group. So unless there's a no around the table, I'll invite Tony to attend and present an update to this group. In terms of the national position, and Tony did sort of cover it off, but there was a workshop held in Hastings in middle of March. We actually deferred this meeting because of that workshop. I was just wondering whether Nick and Craig, do you want to give an update from that? Because some of the work, and it's been noted by Kerry that the papers from that workshop have been shared, but there was most probably the joint working group, which is obviously a group underneath us, was invited to make submissions specifically to the advisors, given that the situation here is quite unique and they haven't encountered a group like this that's actually working effectively and a working group that's actually delivering some outcomes. So that group was specifically, the working group has been specifically asked to provide feedback on the presentation that we had. So Nick and Craig, do you want to just comment briefly on first of all, the framing of the questions that were asked and some of the other things that flow from that? And we're hopeful to have a draft of a presentation shortly that we will then share with this group.
Yes, through you, Chair. So as attached to your agenda, you've got copies of the presentation that DIA, MFE and Ministry of Health presented. And as a group, we unfortunately, in the session, they went into breakout sessions, and whilst talking about the total R or total Y, they created a group where there was a wastewater and stormwater discussion. They created a group where there was a drinking water discussion, and then, particularly unfortunately, they actually created a separate group for the cultural iwi values discussion. So in their own process, they disaggregated the discussion from the start, which we will comment on because actually they're missing the point in that. So that'll be part of our feedback just in terms of their process of how they're having the korero. But in the drinking water discussion, it's to be fair, there was some quite different views because there were some people from outside of the Hawke's Bay region, and one of those chief executives, we had a discussion where he was sort of pushing back on any change because there was nothing wrong, and we pointed out Hawke's Bay, we have a different view, and actually there are problems with the system, and for anyone to say there's not problems with the system, their heads in the sand, and I think we got there. As the Chair says, the Joint Working Group offered to the Ministry of Health, Environment and DIA officials, given the amount of work that we've been doing as a region, and I guess slightly disappointing, they seem to have little awareness, given a lot of our stuff is public and where a lot of the stuff we've done was included in stage 2 of the inquiry. They had little awareness of what we'd been doing, and we've also had staff from Regional Council, our own, and other agencies working with them on other initiatives. So they had little awareness of some of the things that we've done. So in the documents you'll see one of the ones they note in problems with the 3-water regulatory system was a fragmented regulatory system. And the different pieces of legislation and stuff do create issues, but they hadn't even looked or had full awareness of how our joint working group and this committee existed. So part of our submission is to actually go back to them to explain some of our governance structures, some of the things we've found, some of the issues we're seeing as different to some of the issues that they thought exist. So that'll be part of our submission back to them to give some real-world experience. But what we did as a joint working group is we, the week after the session, quickly got those who were available together, just a bit of a brainstorm. Did we agree with the problem statement that actually DIA had? And had they encapsulated it? And from a drinking water side, we've sort of brought it back down to, and I'm just doing some work on it to send out to the group to make sure I'm translating our discussion, is one of the key elements was one of the issues is the inability to be confident of safe drinking water. Now, is that inability to be confident because of lack of knowledge, inability to be confident because the system isn't showing enough evidence back to regulators, to asset owners, to governance, to the general public? So, and then underneath that, there's an element of knowledge, and one of the issues is there's a lot of knowledge, but it's quite disaggregated, and it's incomplete. Compliance doesn't equal safe, and so therefore we do need a system that actually compliance does mean safe, and the community and the agencies need to know that compliance means safe. Doesn't mean guaranteed, but it's a compliance, so we'll be giving feedback on that. A shortage of investment, and so that might be a lot of focus in the Government Three Waters review is a shortage of investment in infrastructure, but what we relayed in our discussions with officials is there's a shortage of investment in research nationally. There's a shortage of research, investment in people and training programs. At the moment, there aren't actually training programs for water operators to do, which is just fundamentally wrong in this process, and you all would have seen in the media with the issues down South Wairarapa at the moment. The current system, not everyone's covered. The affordability and willingness to pay discussion, and then what is the risk appetite? Has the country had that discussion? Where is the return? There are currently weak source water protection controls, and as you're aware, this region we've done a lot of work, and the tank plan change is sort of leading out, taking on that detailed work as well. But the regulatory regimes we work in have limited flexibility and adaptability to new knowledge, and does some of those regulatory activities get in the way of those key health outcomes, both from quality and quantity, because the community needs both to be able to survive. A lot of competing demands, so how do you balance those? And actually one of the issues is the service provision value is not actually understood across all three waters. One of the key points as well was relinking them back, because the direction of travel they talked about is the dedicated drinking water regulator, which almost seems a 99.9%, which will be put in front of Cabinet in the middle of the year. The way they talk is that'll lead out first with the other two waters to follow, because it hasn't been developed enough. But actually, from a drinking water safety, and particularly around source water protection and the wider public health outcome, actually you can't leave those other two for too long. And there are a number of other elements in the document that we'll be pulling together, and I'm just tasked to pull together the team's story, get it back around the joint working group, and then report back out.
I'll just add a couple of points, thanks.
Please, no.
So, yeah, as Craig has mentioned, there's two strategies going on simultaneously. The drinking water work around regulatory change is proposed to go to Cabinet in June, so there's a very tight time frame for that piece of work. The Three Waters review, looking at broader regulation and supply issues, is a much longer time frame. So there's obviously quite a lot of urgency around getting input to this drinking water review. So we'll be going through the proposed response in detail with some feedback to that. I think probably from my point of view, the most potentially concerning of all of these things is the impact on the removal of the drinking water assessors from the current public health team across the country. They are often acting in dual roles and providing health protection service as well as their drinking water auditing role. So there will be a question about the viability of the remaining service once, if the drinking water team were removed from our public health team. Related to that, I think, is another set of issues around whether the enforcement role, which is currently carried out by people who are not the drinking water assessor, were also unbundled, which would take out the rest of our public health team. So there's some quite significant implications for public health generally across the country in this proposal, and it will need to be thought through very carefully if the proposal to establish a drinking water regulator goes ahead. Now, it could be possible to have a national organisation that worked through local public health services and retained the integration at the local level. So that's certainly a possibility. But we want to make sure that government is well aware of the implications of undertaking this kind of major response. The impetus for a drinking water regulator, I think, does come from the government inquiry itself, where certainly one of the inquiry panel was very keen on that idea. And Drinking Water New Zealand, or Water New Zealand, you will have heard on the radio this morning, representatives from Water New Zealand have been very, very vocal about supporting this need for a separate drinking water regulator. So it's certainly got a lot of momentum, but it needs to be carefully worked through.
Thanks, Nick. Craig? Any questions of either of those two gentlemen in terms of the...
If I could just ask, Mr. Chair, I read, the emerging proposals, and I did read of the proposal suggesting disinfection with water and through the distribution system. And my query probably is, listening to some of our Māori communities and some of our community members where there is anxiety about chlorination in our water, is more the engagement with our community and how consultation or how our community is informed. I think there was a comment earlier about people having misinformation or not being perhaps confident in our water status. So it's a big question, but I'm wondering if there are any comments.
So I think it's depending on where the regulation ends up, because there's another group working through on draft potential drinking water guidelines and standards, where that ends up. But everyone talks risk-based, and that can mean lots of different things. So there is an element of education and understanding, and then there's an element of people understanding what the choices and alternatives are. And quite often what's talked about is the models out of the Netherlands and so forth. What's often not talked about is the steps and measures those countries have gone to enable to turn off the disinfection, to keep the water safe from the treatment plant at the creation to the tap in the house. So those are potentially journeys communities might be able to go on. I don't see this current government legislating forcing that right to the nth degree, but the duty of care to demonstrate that you can do without will be extremely onerous, quite expensive, or very expensive. We're currently just getting some information back from Dr. Deere on what the current water pricing is in some of those countries, but I know from his discussion when we had him here recently, many years ago when he went, it was numbers of magnitude higher than Sydney Water were paying, and Sydney Water people pay significantly higher than anyone in Hawke's Bay has ever dreamed of paying. So I think there is an education, there is an awareness, and then there is an understanding of where choice exists, what is the choice and what are the competing elements in there. And different systems have different risks you need to manage depending on the length and the scale and what those risks are. And it doesn't answer your question explicitly, but
yeah,
I think there is a lot of education and awareness that needs to be worked through.
Yeah.
I would add that at the workshop there was representatives from Ngāti Kahungunu, Heneuru and Te Taiwhenua Heretaunga, and I sat in on that particular workshop, and a lot of what you've just said was expressed during that session as well. So they're aware. What they do with that in terms of the DIA, MFE, Ministry of Health is I guess over to them now. But Ngāti Kahungunu have been involved in the development of this joint JWG submission.
Or they will be.
Or they will be.
Yeah.
They weren't able to attend that particular meeting because it was a bit of an emergency meeting.
Yeah.
But they'll be involved in the development of that as well.
So, and I guess through you, Chair, rounding it back to the comment that was made earlier around that duty on the top right, must supply drinking water or ensure supply to everyone in the district. So it's actually working through helping, and we've had discussions in this forum before around marae and papakainga, and so it's around actually how do we help those communities do that safely for themselves, or what support structures need to be in there. So there is a lot of system design to think about how do we deliver on. The primary objective of this is to ensure our community has safe drinking water, and I think we all agree with that, but it's how do we do that in an efficient and effective way, taking in those other things. And I don't have a crystal ball I could offer at the moment.
If I could just add, I mean, I think your question's really about consultation and community input into the decisions around chlorination. And my sense is at the moment it's being looked at more as a technical question, and it's been reviewed in terms of a standard. And I can see merit in that, but I also think, as I'm sure Napier folks here understand that there is a need to bring community along with you on that journey. So, and councils are very good at that. So that I think is sort of also relevant to the discussion around the Three Waters review, because ultimately that structure that's going to deliver these services will need to have some way of reflecting community values.
Thank you. Gentlemen, any further questions?
Just through the chair, just further to that and expanding it to the wider community. I guess, yes, it's about education, but I think it's also the community wants to know that there are other options and that they're being investigated, that it's not just an instant mandate and decision that chlorination is the only answer. The community is aware there are other options, so they just want some reassurance that we're assessing those options, and we'll go back to them with the reasons why it will or won't work and the associated costs, etc.
And timeframes. So to talk through the Netherlands, that was a 15 to 20 year journey that country decided to go on, and they still have issues, but they have quite a different system to what we run in New Zealand, and significantly more expensive. But yeah, they're choices that community needs to be aware of.
And have confidence that we are looking at them rather than just going down one single-minded path. We are looking at, there are aspirational goals that we could be looking at, and designing our infrastructure management plans around those if it did occur in the future that we could remove chloride from our water.
Would it be reasonable to say that in our submission to the Ministry that we should support the retention of an option to explore disinfection-free reticulation?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Is that the feeling of the meeting?
I recall Dr. Deere, when he was on the stand, saying, in his view, chlorination is the most significant improvement in public health in the last 100 years. It's just an opinion, but it seemed to stack up in terms of what's happened and what we all understand about it. None of us like chlorine, but it does work, and it's residual, and I think that's the key thing. You've only got to look at all the leaks around there in Havelock anyway, where I live, to realise the system is fairly impervious, and not impervious, what's the word? It leaks all the time, so it must leak in and out, and that's where the problem.
Not in.
That's where the problem crops up. That you have to have a very secure reticulation system before as I understand, two gentlemen at the end might dispute that, before you can be sure that you are delivering safe drinking water if it's not treated.
Yeah, and I think I'd support what you're saying. I guess what we're saying is in the scope of the review, the potential for a council that has successfully managed all those risks to consider other options. probably needs to be retained within the framework, and that's
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is let's not build up people's hope.
no, true.
Because we need to be sure that we can deliver the infrastructure necessary to achieve that end.
So through you, Chair, just on that, unfortunately my main computer died its battery, so my draft, what I actually changed, my proposal, which hasn't gone through the rest of the group, was changing residual disinfection. It was more that the risk of the distribution system are actively managed. So that enables that discussion, but it needs to be actively managed.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I understand.
Just one other key point that we will be making is around, because it's often lost in this because it gets quite hard, is one of the systems and the joint working group are working through is the connectivity of the Building Act for private homes and the health standards in potable water, because it creates a lot of confusion and there's some funny lines. And I've been having a discussion with one of our small rural communities who asked to take their supply back off the old county council 37 years ago. And they've had some issues, and they have a school on that supply, and they're working through the challenges and liabilities they each held in their roles. And one of their options was to go back to they each manage their own risk and the health, and then each of the TAs have our responsibility as Building Act regulators as well. And at the moment there's a bit of discontinuity or ambiguity, probably more importantly, around how that another element of the fragmented system works or doesn't work.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for the questions. If there's none, then I might move that the verbal report regarding the national position and the response of the joint working group to those just be noted. Would someone like to move? Yeah. Thanks, Simon. Second. Yep. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the Central Hawke's Bay water issues. This was put on the agenda specifically around quantity, and noting the brief of the governance group here and the working group is wide enough to include quantity. And so the Onga Tekio issues were referred to the joint working group. Part of that discussion at the joint working group was that effectively was superseded by a task force that was created between CHB and the regional council, and this is an update. So I'm not going to ask the council to talk to it, but if there's any questions on it, I'm happy to take questions, but if not, I'll just move that the joint committee receives and notes the CHB water update.
Yeah, can I just briefly comment on this? The District Health Board sees the Regional Council having a key responsibility to ensure that irrigation doesn't compromise the quality of drinking water. So, we see that as a Regional Council responsibility to make sure that CDH, Central Hawke's Bay Council, do not compromise the water quality, drinking water quality, due to irrigation.
So I'm happy to respond. So look, and we may have some people down the back who can answer this a bit better than I can, but at the task force we've had quite a few presentations on trying to establish if that isn't in fact the case. And it's probably not surprising that there's still, how well those reports have been received or taken on board. There's still a difference of opinion, so that work is going to be ongoing around the Tuki task force. And we're also talking through that process about our science program, and certainly applications to understand the groundwater interactions better through flying electromagnetic surveys and a bunch of other things. Also worthwhile noting that, and this is probably partially fingers crossed, we do have an application with the Provincial Growth Fund around water security generally in the region, around the issue of quantity as opposed to quality, because that's managed through a number of other processes, even though they're obviously related. Part of what we are hoping for is a commitment to support a regional water assessment, which will give us an opportunity to look very closely at at these types of supplies, and so we're sort of waiting with bated breath to extent that that's going to be supported. But recently, our council approved policy for regional council to provide match funding to that program if it goes ahead. And if it doesn't go ahead, then the scope will have to be rejigged, and we'll look at it. So. So Councillor Bailey, you've spent quite a bit of time down in CHB recently. Have you got any?
No, that was Councillor Belford, but that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just take? I'll come back to you. I can just take from that, Nick. Sorry, Tom. That there's reference in here to accessing grant funding from the council for individual sort of households, and that's going to be taken on a case-by-case basis. Has anybody actually taken that up at the moment, or is it work in progress?
So we've got a guy down the back who can answer that with either a nod or a shake of the head. And so that program is in place and is available for people to get water tanks and things like that. But that's we're conscious of the fact that Kevin raised, and that's a remedy, a short-term remedy, but it doesn't necessarily fix the symptom, which is the main concern. And so, while there are solutions there, it doesn't mean that we're not continuing to look at the main issues. So is it all right if I just ask Mark Heaney to provide an update on?
Thank you, through the chair. The Sustainable Homes Programme does allow residents in Tukia to access funding via the Regional Council for purchasing water storage tanks. This is not necessarily a potable supply, but is potentially there to ensure that there is sufficient water if there is an impact on wells that are shallow and surface pumps failing to deliver. Whether there is a direct link to the irrigation or not is still questionable. The term grant is perhaps a little misleading because it is adoption of a voluntary targeted rate on that property, which is paid back over a period of time. And it does accrue an interest rate, so it is not technically a grant, it is a VTR, it's a voluntary targeted rate.
Okay, right, thank you. Sorry, Nick.
Well, I think there's a general point here that is good for this group to think about, which is if, and I know it's contestable whether or not the irrigation has contributed in this case, but if we postulate that as we increase irrigation, we have a cycle of water levels within our aquifers that actually drops slower than previously was the case. Is it fair for people who have been able to extract water for their own personal use to then have to pay for additional infrastructure to be able to get their basic needs of drinking water met? And we've obviously seen that happen in other places. So I think there may not be an answer today, but to me there is an equity issue and a justice issue there.
Is that a question for me?
If you wanted to answer that, you could, Tom, but if you're not, you can defer.
I can't answer that question because I can't speak for fairness and equity across the community. And I think part of the balancing act here is, and it's part of the granularity of this investigation, is to understand exactly, let's find exactly which bores are a problem and why. And that's why, if CHB DC were here, there might have been a chance for them to provide a more meaningful update. But I think, in principle, yes, you're correct. But then there's the ongoing discussion that needs to be had. Is that if there is, one or two or three or a small number of, what we call, relatively inefficient bores, what's the cost of gearing the entire system to those bores? So that's where perhaps there needs to be some discussions and things like that. And I believe, and perhaps I'm talking anecdotally, that there has been some discussion amongst some groundwater users there about supplying water across there, but I doubt whether that's going to survive any test of the new regulation. I don't think they'll be wanting to.
I suppose just the general principle. I mean, if we as a region agree that there is economic gain to be allowing more irrigation, but the consequences are for a few users that they suffer some financial loss as a result, then it seems to me appropriate that they would be compensated for that.
At the end, I'd add to that, Nick, at the end of the day, it's also up to the irrigation community to maintain their social licence to operate.
Yep.
And one of those, and this is one of the issues, which is fast depleting their bank of social licence. And it's an issue that needs to be dealt with one way or the other.
Chair, we're sort of, talking CHB, I know, but just picking up on Kevin's point, I would have thought a better word than irrigation is just extraction, because it could be used for potentially industrial, water, bottling, a whole range of things.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, Malcolm, yes.
I just want to point out that there is a regional policy that we have which does address this issue to a point, but it's to give access to water. So it's saying that if there's say in principle, a large bath of water, the person taking the water at the top won't be protected if more water is to be taken. So it's the reference Tom made to efficient bores. If you're taking and your bore is not particularly efficient, it's maybe a surface water pump, only capable of drawing down to about 7 metres, but would be reliable if it could draw down to 16 metres, then that's not necessarily protected. So there's policy giving that steer already, which is what we administer. And what you're saying, Nick, I think is perhaps it should be the other way around. But
I mean, what's seen as efficient today might not be efficient tomorrow too. So the 16 metres, may not be sufficient at some future date. So what was sufficient, 7 metres was okay 30 years ago, and is now no longer okay. So that person is having to invest additional infrastructure to get basic water that they need.
Yeah, and I think Councillor Bailey's point is salient, because the next time there's a plan change, then as we've seen through the tank process, there has been a requirement for groundwater users to recognise their impacts and contribute. So I suppose it's part of the evolution of the community's views on these issues.
Just a further question, Gareth. I take it a paper or something similar to this is going to be presented to the Regional Council at some point in the future with the results of the survey?
I think it has, but I'll check. And if it hasn't, it will.
I don't think it has.
Okay.
Just for
Charles.
I think I do seem to recall that there was the same problem over in Bridgepower, is it?
Yes, in
Paki.
20 years ago, 15 years ago.
No, not that long.
Not that long
Not
ago.
that long ago. We just
8.
got water to
Less than 10, I'd say.
Oh, okay. But things obviously haven't been changed or haven't been done.
We put water in.
Significant.
It doesn't stop the
Irrigation, wasn't it, to be fair?
And Tom,
Wineries.
yeah, Tom just made the point that the implications of the new regulations, as they are presently drafted, or if they come out even very similar, are huge. And it does come back to one of those mandates. Does virtually every person in Hawke's Bay have the right to access clean, safe drinking water? And you've got to say the answer to that is yes. But then it's how we deliver that and the different forms of delivery that are questioned. But do you actually challenge that mandate at all? And it shouldn't be challenged. Well, if it is, then there's some good logic and reasons need to be put forward. So I think it's how we actually deliver those that is going to be the challenge. Okay, well, thank you. The next item on the agenda is a tank clean change, and I'm not on the update. And sorry, we haven't moved. Can someone move that the CHB water update?
I've about 3 times.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. The tank clean change and resource update.
Okay. So there are 2 key elements to the tank update for you. One specifically is around the source protection zones. We had done some work within the Regional Council around numeric modelling, and we have one of our experts sitting down the back if I need any assistance on this. Thank you. When we presented this back to the JWG as an option, which was essentially, we felt, providing a more robust assessment of the source protection zones. There was general feedback from the JWG was that we needed to undertake a peer review. So GNS provided that for us, and as you see in point 3 there, they've essentially concluded that this is an appropriate approach. We are still undertaking further analysis on a minor point, I believe, which Hastings have asked GNS to review. Which, have we had any feedback from that, Craig? Sorry, I haven't had
So
chance to
we're
catch
waiting for the feedback from GNS. So when there was a meeting of all the parties, there was just a couple of details to work through.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Sally, the person at GNS isn't quite available because she's on secondment in Australia, so they're working through that. The other unfortunate one, which I guess goes back to the earlier comment, is Nick, through the Ministry of Health, also requested for ESR to help us out to do a review, but Ministry of Health didn't approve the funding for ESR to have a look at this work, so that's a letter that I'll be also writing. My second letter to the Director General of Health asking for assistance. So there is a bit of work just to finalise that out, but that's more around which line on the map are we using.
But essentially, what was determined by the JWG was that this was an appropriate approach based on the GNS report for use within the tank plan change. We also looked at whether we might be able to add some flexibility within the policy so that we weren't cementing, if you like, the SPZ maps within the plan itself. We had lent to Environment Canterbury for some steer on this because what they have done is included their source protection zone mapping within a geography information system, a database which the public can access, and they don't actually hold those maps within the plan. We had hoped that they would have some legal advice which supported this approach, but unfortunately they don't. So if we are looking to include that level of flexibility within the tank plan, we'll need to seek our own independent legal advice on that particular style of approach. But the benefit of doing that is that as science improves, we've got this SkyTem, this electromagnetic research being undertaken. When things do change, as innovations, become apparent, we can then refine the source protection zones and be more accurate. Whereas if we put those those maps specifically within the plan, we're tied into referring to those particular maps until such a time as we can undertake a further plan change. So we are still researching that option of the flexibility. In terms of the actual plan change itself, moving on to point 7 there, we have undertaken our pre-notification consultation. There was an extension to that time agreed by the Regional Planning Committee to the 29th of March. We've received 3 responses from iwi, 2 from the Napier City Council and from the TLAs, 1 from Napier City Council, 1 from Hastings. Nothing from the Ministry for the Environment as of yet. And staff are just reviewing those comments that we've received, and we will be reporting those back to the Regional Planning Committee in May.
Thanks.
Questions?
Yes.
Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of the special protection zones around the Hastings bore fields, in terms of the flow and the flow directions, through Tonkin and Taylor and GNS, we obviously know more than we did 3 years ago. And I see there's still another report to come. When that report comes, will we know it all, or will we just know more than we did 3 years ago?
Through you, Chair, I think that goes exactly to the point. We know a significant amount more this year than we did 2 years ago, than we did 5 years ago, than we did 10 years ago. However, with the SkyTem going up, with the massive GNS, ESR, government-funded research project that's going on, which is looking at it a lot more detail, in another 3 years, we might find some of the things that we fully believed in and locked and loaded as a given could have been wrong too. So our knowledge, we need to stay open to our knowledge developing. It's fair to say we've learnt lots and we'll continue to learn more. I don't see them changing massively. It might be more scale of how fast. One of the, because of our aquifer system, very similar to Canterbury, one of the key attributes is you can get a lot of volume out. It flows, but that's actually from a health perspective its biggest weakness because it flows fast. And so it's understanding how do the different pathways flow, because it has lots of little places where water can get through really quickly and others that it goes through slowly, and there are multiple layers, and how do those all interact. So there's a lot of science, and Jeff's sitting in the back who could answer this way better than me, but I will guarantee you in 3 years' time or 4 years' time, there'll be some things that we'll then know that'll be completely different to what we believe now.
We've got Jeff, I'm not sure, chief scientist, mathematician, not quite, but if you've got any comments you'd like to add to that discussion or contribute.
I just totally agree with Craig that we know a great deal more than what we have done, but there are some really significant projects coming up. That electromagnetic survey and the GNS funded, it's like a $10 million project. They're using the Heratoma Plains as a case study to identify those small scale pathways. And what Craig was talking about is you can have these really small layers of open framework gravels that the groundwater travels extremely fast through, and that can take the bugs through to bores really quickly, but we don't know where those are. So in the modelling now, we've had to assume that the whole aquifer is made up of this really fast gravel system, and as we get to know where they are and we're able to model those smaller scales in the model, then we can reduce the size of those source protection zones. So they're conservatively very large at the moment, and over time they should get smaller, and more certainty will be with those.
Thank you.
And that's likely to be one of the other points that the joint working group will make to the regulatory review, that the relationship between the regulatory body and source protection zones need to have an easier, well, not an easier pathway, but they need to be linked to the actual planning processes that they actually go through, and you can't afford to wait 5 years to have a new source protection zone defined if in actual fact that's going to affect public health and safety in the longer term, to make the planning regime work. And so that interrelationship is a key part, most probably, of the regulatory model that will be required.
So through you, Chair, a key other element, and it does relate back to quantity and getting access to water. So the potential downsides of having additional controls is when you go to put a new drinking water bore in and you say this is the new source protection zone area, the affected parties probably won't want you there. And so how do you work through that process, and as the regulatory system recognises how does that recognise the value of the drinking water to enable you to move into town, if you like. So there are a whole pile of processes which need to be mapped through and thought through carefully, so we don't end up with paralysis by regulation and miss actually what we're trying to achieve.
Just a question, Garth. If you just refresh my memory, has Napier City Council put in their source protection zones into the...
So they initiated work with Tonkin and Taylor, but based on the JWG decision that this was a better approach going with the numerical modelling, they're looking to apply that. But they have appointed, I believe, Tonkin and Taylor to undertake that numerical modelling using the Hawke's Bay Regional Council data.
Okay, so we should have it in time to be put into the tank process.
Yes,
has to be.
Yeah, it has to be.
Yeah.
No, they're aware of the time frame, so they're working to that.
Cool. Okay, well, thanks. Would someone like to move that the tank plan change and the report on the source protection zones be received and noted?
I'm happy to do that, Garth.
The next item is the joint working group activities, and you've already heard a few of them going on, but
So I'll keep this very brief. At our last JWG meeting, we also tacked on our comms workshop. There are a number of protocols that had been drafted probably a year ago, and we were just looking to make sure that they were appropriate. And there was a discussion around that. We've almost got there. I think we should be able to report back to you next time and say that we've adopted them. We're hoping to present those back at the next JWG meeting. And likewise, there was an arsenic information sharing protocol, which have also been drafted, but that was just waiting on some additional information before that could be finalised. So again, that will be reported back to you at your next meeting.
Can I just ask a question on that?
Yes.
Is the 2002 Act the only measure that you're considering in that protocol?
I will have to defer that because Liz Lambert's actually been preparing that.
First of all, 2002 is quite some time ago, and I just wonder if there's other aspects we should be considering as part of that
Do you know?
protocol.
I think
other than the Act.
I think Kevin, you was referring to the local government decision-making process provisions, which
oh, down the bottom. Sorry, I thought you were talking about the protocol.
Which is around, my understanding, well, let the local government experts talk about what that process is.
Well,
That's around consulting with community, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a standard, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah, there's no decision making.
No, there's no decision making, but that's yeah.
But the protocol does take into account the sensitivity and the privacy of some individuals, because the issue has been where one house or a private bore has been discovered to have arsenic. There's an obligation, obviously, and they don't want it known necessarily that they have a problem. But equally, their neighbours do need to know, because if they're taking a bore from a similar aquifer, then they will have similar problems. So the protocol does cover all those issues and delegates.
Yeah, and there would be
between the DHB or the.
There'd be other relevant pieces of legislation, the Health Act.
Yeah.
And the drinking water standards and so on. So yes, it does cover other issues. Yeah.
And it also talks to who would be the one then to speak with the neighbours, etc. And it's
we're working through that.
We're working through that issue at the moment, but we again hope to have that report back to you.
Is it a more common occurrence at the there is an issue at the moment that's not most probably commonly known about. So is it a more common thing that's occurring?
Do you want to comment, Jeff?
Yeah, I think
people are testing more.
Is he gone?
So post Havelock North, people are testing their private water more. So people are putting filters on their water tanks, because once they always knew their water tanks had some interesting things in them, but when they tested it, it become real. So I think there's a lot more testing going on, but also as part of the TA's regulatory approach, when people are doing building consents now, we're getting them to test for more things. And so the more you test, the more you find out the things you never knew because you never looked.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's more common or it's just more awareness.
So, well, the Regional Council also published advice that people do need to test anyone who has their own bore. So we expect more testing. Yeah.
So, question, Jeff? Yes, thanks. I know we've got protocols in there for arsenic. Are there any other things that we should be looking at for doing protocols on? Is there any other issues like that you've got? We're talking about arsenic because there was an issue with it, and it brought our awareness. Is there anything we're missing that we should be looking at?
Any other chemical contaminant would be the same approach, I think. I mean, the key difference with arsenic is that to date it's been primarily naturally occurring, rather than as a result of a pollution event, which would be handled differently. So
is it worthwhile then looking at doing protocols for everything else?
Just make it generic.
I think it would be
a generic type thing. Yeah,
I think it'll be arsenic and other type. Yeah. Does manganese have the same public health aspects to it?
There are risks around high levels of manganese, but to date we haven't found that in the self-supplies. It's been an issue more in articulations, isn't it?
Well, we've monitored it more heavily in reticulated, and particularly the issue is when you have high iron and manganese and you chlorinate a system, you get a chemical reaction, and people's whites go orange. Your balance is a little bit out, so you're managing that from what's the effect on treatment. One of the other items that for the joint working group, just working through though, what are the other, so we have under a Lifelines view natural hazard risks, but what are the other risks that we should be aware of from which relates back to source protection zone, so what are the other industries, what are the other things that could happen, and what does that look like, and do we have a standard operating procedure in case that happens, particularly around some of the larger industry. There might be a drinking water, but there may be other elements for the TAs and all these agencies. So if you had a big, some of the chlorine tanks at some of the industry things, so just working through that with the wider entities. So I think that discussion is going to be raised at the KEG meeting with the Civil Defence Emergency Management.
There's transport issues too, potentially with big spills of diesel or chemicals on the expressway.
So just moving on to the other couple of items. So 2.3 and 2.4, Craig's already touched on. That's with regard to the workshop. Oh, sorry, 2.4 and 5 with the workshop. 2.3, we had hoped to have updates on our water safety plans from the TLAs on a regular basis, but that's essentially been or was put on hold so that we could deal with the workshop and the Three Waters review. So we're looking to recommence those at our next meeting with, I believe, Hastings.
Okay.
Yeah, let's say Hastings. You're here. And then the final item, DHB had advised us that they're updating their public health resources and had asked for us to, peer review and to be able to share that as a collective co-branded resource.
One of the, it just reminds me, one of the areas that we haven't just touched on is that is 6 principles of safe drinking water, and obviously looking at developing training or the opportunity most probably to have this group go through that course, and certainly we'll get feedback on that as well as we go further down the field. But Craig,
yes, through you, Chair, I was going to raise that just as an an item at the end, just to really gauge the committee's view. So due to the lack of training, we've been working through with some of the external agencies and experts, and we've worked through with Carly Price, who come out of the regulator in the UK, but also does a lot of educating aspects. And so at our operational level, we started with a 6 principles training for our operators, our contractors, our staff and management staff. And then the last part of the module, I had to create a governance level element, an element of the 6 principles training targeted for governance level. And that prototype was run for our councillors from Hastings District whilst Dr. Deere was here. So Dr. Deere co-presented it to her, and my recommendation to Garth was I think it would be really useful to invite Carly to present before or after one of these workshops, just to give all you as members of this group an understanding, give some feedback into that. I have also spoken to LGNZ from a sector view, because there's a number of councils across the country that I think could do for the governance level, to understand what are the questions they should be asking, what is the learnings from the inquiry, because there's a lot of misinformation or denial or probably misinformation of the learnings that we had as a region. So it was a recommendation, perhaps, if this committee was wanting to, that we could coordinate Carly to come along and do that training session with you, either at the front of an agenda or after, and then I'm sure she'll be available to go to each of the independent councils as well.
so it's the onus really is on this group if you want to participate in that, or arrange for Carly to be here to do it. Perhaps at the next, I know it's most probably some time away, but if we could organise that, or if you're agreeable to that, then it's certainly available. So it's really some feedback from you as to whether you'd like to be included in that process.
Seeing enough nodding heads, Garth?
Yeah. No, we'll take that as a yes and record it. That we'll add that. It'll most probably be added at the end of the agenda because normally we start at 1. So as soon as we finish, then Carly will be in a position to then step up. It was thoroughly, well received by the Hastings Council. So I think establishing those 6 principles, and once you start understanding those, it does drive a different mentality in terms, certainly at the governance level, and there's been a number of questions from the councillors around, well, what's a template? What are the questions we need to be asking every month or every 3 months or 6 months around the delivery model, making sure that it's not a tick-the-box exercise. So no, we'll look to include that on the agenda for the next item. So on that basis, can someone move that the governance, the joint working group report be received? Noted, thank you. That brings us to the end of the formal agenda item. Is there any other areas that anyone would like to raise? I'm happy to take them on just an informal basis. No, they weren't raised at the start. Yes, Tony.
Just wanted to raise that one of, we talked about engagement with the DHB as well as this group, and just to let you know that we started working with Garth around how the governance structures fit in with the new models going forward, so to get a better understanding of how this joint committee works and also how that might relate to a model in the future. I think that's a key part of our review. So we'll continue to work with Garth and other members.
Okay, well, if there's no further... yes.
Look, just expertise around the room might just help me. I'm sure I've heard on TV or somewhere that Christchurch were planning to move away from chlorination.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if that is the case, how do they get on with the 2-tier protection of their water? Because I should imagine if they do it, there'll be a cry from everybody around here, well, if Christchurch can do it, why can't we do it?
There is already a big
is.
cry. Yeah, there is a big cry.
They're nearly there. 98% by June.
So how do they get away with it in terms of the protection?
I haven't got it approval to turn off yet.
I think that's a very big question, a big topic for us to bring up at this time in the meeting.
It's an interesting topic because even if you have secure bore water, it doesn't secure the network.
No.
And so there's a whole host of questions around that. And then if you look at the options around the network, it's got to be pressurised. You've got to be able to ring fence different areas and all the other things from overseas jurisdictions, and a whole host of pressure, making sure that things can't backflow in virtually every house. So them being able to provide the degree of confidence, my overall take would be they will not be able to take chlorine out of the system because they will not be able to produce for the regulator enough evidence that says they are managing the risk in the reticulation system.
Can I just add, I think it's worth noting that we've already had this discussion with the Ministry of Health and made it very clear that there has to be consistency in anything that is done. So they're very well aware of that. We've got officials from the Ministry of Health coming up next week, the same people who are talking to Christchurch. So we're making sure that there's not something being done somewhere else that is not the same as what's being done.
And the difficult aspect with that is even at a political level, even if they did do something, the right thing to do for our people here in terms of public health is to have a disinfectant in the reticulation system. So, and they may get away with it for 2, 3, 5 years, but then if they do have a problem, it will be a massive problem.
Someone will go to
we've
jail.
Experienced, we can't afford to do that. And I think it's very difficult from a political point of view because people are standing for a re-election later in the year and everything else that goes with it. It would be nice to say, well, we're going to go back. That's not an option in this region at the moment until there's a significant amount of work and, for the next 20 years to get a pressurised system like some of the overseas jurisdictions and everything else. It would be twice the cost of 4 times the cost. For that. But that, just question on that though, and I just make the point, we pay for electricity without batting an eyelid. We have an internet and all the other things, and we pay monthly, and our Sky bill comes in or whatever for those that have it. But how much do we really pay for our water to have clean, safe drinking water? And so I do believe the question of value has never really been seriously tested in New Zealand, and I think it's going to be one of the next hurdles that we have to grapple with, even with the new model. If there is a commonality of approach, that's going to challenge that thinking, and quite rightly, it should be challenged, because we pay $200, $300 a month for our power.
Oh, Jesus. Solar.
Sorry. But anyway, thank you very much. Declare the meeting. Oh, sorry. Can we just have a quick closure? Thank you.
Kia tātou. Me kara kia tātou te manaakitanga kia tau, kia tātou katoa. Te atapai tō tātou ara kia I karaiti, me te aroha te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairu tapu.
Ake. Amen.
Kia ora.
Again, thank you.